Well, the drama is building as House of David races towards its endgame. Episode 7, the season's penultimate episode, is titled David and Goliath Part 1, and sees all of the game pieces arranged for the epic showdown that I think everyone has been eagerly waiting to see. There's a lot going on this week, so let's talk about it. So here we are with just one episode remaining and what I think has been a very excellent first season. And let me just say too that it's been a lot of fun just kind of digging into this show every week. The show is probably the closest thing in like the faith-based entertainment world has ever had to a sort of like water cooler show. So I appreciate all you guys who've been watching along with me and commenting in these videos. But as for this week, I think overall it's another really good episode, although perhaps like slightly anticlimactic. I liked almost like everything actually going on this week, but it also felt like just a lot of table setting to like build towards the finale. And it's interesting to me that like, this episode is titled David and Goliath Part 1, even though those two title characters like don't actually share the screen in this episode. So I think it's perhaps better to like think of this episode almost has like the first half of a 2-hour season finale, just divided across 2 weeks, rather than as like a standalone episode itself. But that's not to say that there isn't also some really interesting material this week. As far as like adapting the biblical text, the episode more or less covers the material from 1 Samuel 17, verses 1 to 20, and it does stay fairly true to scripture. Although, and while not as controversial as like divergent from the Bible as episode 6 was, there is at least one, I think, significant like kind of recontextualization of the narrative regarding like how David fits into the story. But before I get to that, I should note that I think this episode is probably the best the show has done so far, just at like communicating scale and scope. I wasn't able to find anything like 100% definitive about this show's budget, but I believe it's like upwards of $100 million for the full season. So this is not a cheap show by any means, but I'm not sure that it has always like felt big. Last week, the show used like AI technology to generate the opening sequence of that heavenly rebellion, which I have somewhat mixed feelings about and just seems like a bit like a corner cutting technique. And I actually made a separate video where I get into that in more detail. So I'll link that below if you want to check that out. But as I've also said too, the show has also frequently used sort of the old school Hollywood trick of filming a lot of the action with like dim lighting and like fog to mask like the smaller scope of the production. But this week, I think more than any of the previous episodes, it really feels like a big budget show because the scenes of like the Philistines and like the Israelite armies facing off are impressive and vast with like a big sense of like big budget spectacle. And I shared my like in-depth thoughts on Goliath last week, so I won't repeat those here, but he is once again awesome this week and is portrayed in a way like with his dialogue and like his appearance and like his armor that is consistent with the biblical text. And one like smaller detail that I like this week is how Goliath sort of like plants a spear in the ground to mark each day that he issues forth the challenge to the Israelites. And it's a small and like mostly inconsequential detail, but I think it's also the sort of like visual storytelling that a lot of faith-based entertainment simply has often lacked. Because traditionally there's always been, I think, an over-reliance just on like verbal exposition, kind of more in the wheelhouse of preachers and evangelists rather than like artists and storytellers. So I like that in details like this, and I think in many others throughout this season, the show has clearly put thought into like the visual medium of its story. But let's get back to David, because so this episode ends, I think, as expected, with him heading to the battlefield and like the inevitable showdown with Goliath. But I think the context of his departure does differ from scripture, I think, in several regards. Because David's story in the Bible is in many ways like an embodiment of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey archetype or monomyth, kind of in the mold of Luke Skywalker or Harry Potter or like Frodo Baggins, as a young shepherd boy who like ventures out to slay a giant and ultimately become a king. But while that like narrative foundation is there, the show also seems to be conforming the story even more to like align with the more like Hollywoodized hero's journey tropes and kind of framing him more as a sort of like chosen one or boy of destiny. Because in the Bible, David's father essentially sends him off as like an errand boy to bring some bread and cheese to his brothers. And so his encounter with Goliath is more like an act of divine providence of him just sort of being in the right place at the right time. In contrast, the show more like strongly emphasizes like David's journey to the battle lines as part of his like destiny, because instead of going as like an errand boy, his father appears to recognize David's special calling, kind of sending him off to go join the fight, knowing that he has like the hand of God on his life. Because like as David departs, his father says, "Rise, my son, rise." And of course, like different doesn't necessarily mean better or worse, unless you have like a problem with any alterations to like the original biblical narrative. Personally, I don't really have a problem with the change, and it does make sense why the showrunners opted for the more like standard hero's journey motif. At the same time, and obviously we'll need to see how it plays out next week, but there is something powerful about like the original biblical version of having David arrive as an outsider and just like see a need, and then respond by stepping up to face the challenge, rather than being driven by a more like cliched sense of like larger destiny. Again, this is not really a criticism of the show, just I think another example of kind of the trade-off or like byproduct of translating the story cinematically. As far as like thematic material this week, I think the episode is really all about just making proper sacrifice to God and like the acknowledgement of like man's proper place in relation to a holy God. Because like having David recite the law of Moses to Samuel about offering the best of the flock, and then paralleling that with Samuel challenging Jesse that he too needs to surrender the best of his own flock, meaning to like not selfishly withhold David, I thought was just really clever and well done. And along those same lines, I think this was another like really great episode from Stephen Lang as Samuel. His talk about like shampooing his beard, I thought was pretty hilarious. But I think the best quote in like the entire episode is when he tells David, "Men ask, is God for us? Is God with us? But the question they should be asking is, are we with God?" And I think that quote ties into like the theme of sacrifice and kind of how we are in service to God, not God in service to us. And it clearly contrasts with Saul, and I think even Jonathan and Michal to a degree, who claim like God as being on their side. Because you have Jonathan telling the young soldier, "What do we have to fear? God is with us," almost treating God as like a secret weapon to ensure victory, although it's also pretty clear that he's not like quite as confident as he pretends. I should note too that the episode also addresses some of my previous concerns from previous weeks, in that it presents God in a much more, I think, relational way. Because while many of the characters kind of give lip service and call upon God to give them victory, I thought it was a really nice moment to kind of have both David and Jesse kind of simultaneously voice very like personal and heartfelt prayers. Speaking of the Bible, I noticed at least two other, I think, noteworthy kind of biblical allusions. First, you have Samuel saying, "For everything there is a season and a time," which is obviously a quote from the famous passage in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Although, like, interestingly, the book of Ecclesiastes is generally considered by scholars to have been written like after 1 Samuel, and at least traditionally is often attributed to King Solomon, who is David's eventual son. So it doesn't necessarily make sense for Samuel to be quoting it here, since it wouldn't have been written yet. Although I think it's also possible to say that David like hears the wisdom here and like eventually passes that on to his son, who ultimately puts it into writing. And the second reference that I noticed is that Samuel also makes the statement about David, "A fire burns in his heart like the Lord's own." And the quote obviously echoes 1 Samuel 13:14, which is also quoted in the New Testament in Acts chapter 13, that describes David as being a man after God's own heart. And it's such like an iconic and like definitive description of the historical David that I think it's pretty cool to see it get a call out in the show this week. Speaking of men and women getting high praise, the last few weeks I've sort of been awarding like an MVP of the episode. So I think this week's honor goes to a character that I don't think I have mentioned yet in any of these reviews, and that is Abner, who is played by actor Oded Fear. And he's, I think, been great like all season, but he just gets a lot to do like in this episode. I thought his banter with King Saul while preparing for battle is just a really like great moment with some really crisp dialogue. And to me, like every show like this with lots of royal court drama or like political intrigue just needs a savvy political advisor character like him. And again, if you know like the biblical story, you know that his character does have a very like interesting role to play later on. And lastly, like I've done with each of these recaps, we can end with sort of a miscellaneous list of just other observations or things I noticed this week. First, the early scene with Jonathan talking to the young child warrior before the battle is an almost identical moment as Aragon before the Battle of Helm's Deep in The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers. And it's so similar that I think it has to be like an intended homage. And hey, as a Lord of the Rings nerd, I appreciate seeing that. Second, and this may be overly nitpicking, but I just found like the ending dialogue between David and Samuel just to be a little bit odd because you have Samuel tell David, "You have the heart of a lion, and what do lions do? They roar." And then David sort of laughs at this, and it's all played as like a lighthearted moment, which just feels kind of at odds with the fact that like David's mother was tragically killed by a lion and that she gave her own life like to protect him. So just like asking him what do lions do feels like it should land a little bit differently, especially with like the emotional backdrop of David reflecting on his mother's sacrifice, just like several scenes earlier. And obviously, it's not a major issue, but it just feels like a moment that lacks some attention to detail in a show that has generally been pretty good in that way. Thirdly, I've mentioned before that I think it's cool to get such like a heavy emphasis on David as a musician, but I should also mention too that like, the overall music and score for this show has also been really good. Also, I think for anyone that has enjoyed David actor Michael Iskender's like voice, but wish they could hear him sing in English, we get a treat during the end credits, and it turns out the dude is a great singer in every language. And lastly, we do get some confirmation this week about David's birth, because it turns out that he's not really a bastard after all, and his father didn't commit adultery. We learn that like Jesse keeps David close, not out of shame, but actually out of love. And like in the Bible, David's mother is actually never mentioned by name, so it's all speculation and like made up for the show. But overall, I think I'm good with this explanation, and I do like it more than like having him be a bastard in a more like nefarious sense. But overall, I think this is another good episode, if slightly less dramatic and like spectacular than I maybe expected. I think the show has done a lot of building in this first season, so I do think a lot of the success will hinge upon like how well it hits that landing. I'm expecting an epic David and Goliath showdown next week, but I'm also curious like what other developments will happen to lead this into season 2. But I would love to hear what you thought of the episode and just how you're feeling about the show as a whole going into the finale. So don't be shy, jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation about it. If you haven't done so too, I encourage you guys, become a collider, subscribe to the channel. Got lots of other movie reviews, got our Faith and Pop Culture podcast, got interviews, just other fun stuff. Would love to have you guys be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide with your world for Christ.